Many people say, oh, I think I'm having a heart orgasm. I don't even know how to describe this. It's like my heart is blooming. And I'm not doing anything. And they have an inner experience, and the emotion from the inner experience is lasting for weeks. Now, that is a new level of understanding because they're more prone to see possibilities that they've never seen before because they're no longer emotionally looking at their future or their life through the lens of the past. And at the same time, if experience enriches the brain and they have a profound moment, we don't see things how they are, we see things how we are. So all of a sudden now they have the circuitry in place to begin to perceive a little broader spectrum of reality. They begin to see things through another lens. They begin to observe things that they could never see before because their brain wasn't wired to perceive it. So now we perceive 1% of reality, and all of a sudden the mystical starts to become more common in their life. I mean, the brain, we see things by pattern recognition. If we don't have the pattern in place, we'll walk right past it. So now there's patterns in place that are more abstract. There are patterns in place that are more mystical. There are patterns in place that are attuned to greater frequencies. And all of a sudden the mystical starts becoming more common in the person's life. And if they've run into the divine, that energy, and their brain is beginning to connect to it and experiencing it, and then they have that mystical moment, they just may see the divine in every human being because their brain is now wired for it. And if they're feeling more whole, then there's less separation between two people. And you would never do anything to another person that you wouldn't do to yourself because you're feeling more oneness and wholeness. And I think that's how we begin to change the species, at least speaking from my present state of ignorance. Look, I mean, there's a skeptic in me that I call it my truth meter, you know, and I've had this experience enough times, and I've been wrong many times because you'll see a person say, oh my God, in that meditation this happened and that happened and this happened. They're telling you their subjective experience. And many times, you know, I'm not sure if I believe them, right? But just because I'm not having that experience. But when you see a person's brain and they're all of a sudden cruising along and you're looking at that strip chart and all of a sudden, boom, and the person's not moving, there's no artifacts, they're completely still, we're checking their muscle tone, and then all of a sudden it starts happening more and more and more, and all of a sudden it looks like a snowstorm on the strip chart with all those high amplitudes, and their whole brain is in high gamma, and they're experiencing super coherence, and the amplitudes are forcing gamma into the standard deviations that are so outside normal, and you're watching this subjective experience, and it's producing quite an objective measurement. Now that person cannot make their brain do that. It's happening to them. It's happening to them, and you don't see that in clinical settings because that's not really normal. So then it's taken them some time to get in that state, but when we see that and we say to the person, when we interview them what was happening, and they tell the story of whatever it was, it's so articulate and it's so specific and it correlates with the timing. We now know that they're having a profound transcendental moment. And so then how do we induce that? How do we create it? What are the patterns? And now our patterns even now are starting to evolve further. I just never even thought about it. So now we're seeing the certain things that coherent theta patterns, when a person's in that super relaxed state, that twilight state, that we can induce that state. And when they have coherent theta patterns, theta is the carrier for those high gamma patterns. And now we're seeing theta patterns, 10 standard deviations outside of normal. Not once, not twice, this is the new pattern. So all of a sudden we're scratching our heads and saying, wow, in order to get that, we now know what we have to do to get to those patterns. And so, boom, another link, and we see the autonomic nervous system on the S. Loretta, on the three-dimensional brain, hotter than hot. I mean, it is on fire. It's because the autonomic nervous system is now processing a greater frequency, a greater stream of consciousness, and latent systems tend to switch on in the brain, and all of a sudden that person then can recognize that feeling and hopefully surrender in the same way. Now, we have students we just measured in Berlin. There was somebody that didn't show up for the brain scan, and I just sent over one of our team leaders, one of our people that helps us with our events, and she goes into gamma brainwave patterns, 400 standard deviations outside of normal, and so here she goes where she closes her eyes. The music starts, and by conditioning, she's not doing anything except sitting there, and 1 minute, the brain scientists are jumping out of their chair and they're putting their hands on their head like, how can this be? 1 minute in, she switches on. She now knows how to do it. And here we go now. Now we're using a technique where she's opening her eyes, and she's closing her eyes and opening her eyes in trance, and while she's opening her eyes, she's now going in from theta to gamma, theta to gamma, theta to gamma, and you're thinking, this is so anomalous, and yet it's voluntary. Wow, I mean, that's, and I think so many things in the world remind us of separation. Whether you're watching the news and there's war, or there's prejudice, or there's fear, or competition, whatever that is, I think that all of those things that have been the structures of the old model, can't sustain themselves at this level of our evolution and consciousness. So they all have to spiral out. They all have to become disorderly, and we're seeing that around the world right now. And that we should not face those breakdowns with the same emotional states, because then we're reinforcing it. We have to rise above it, and if you can understand that every biological system always moves to incoherence or disorder before it reorganizes. And so I was thinking about this the other day, and there's so much chaos going on, so much disorder, and I thought, well, maybe chaos is just unpredictable order. And I really do believe that. So then we have to be able to sustain brain and heart coherence right when everything's breaking down, because then if you're doing that and I'm doing that, you're giving me permission to be that way. And if I'm doing that, I'm giving you permission to be that way. We're not going back into the old programs again, and then all of a sudden everybody starts seeing that you're behaving differently or in a new state of being. They're less likely to fall from grace and try to resolve those challenges from the same level of consciousness, the same level of energy, the same emotional state as the consciousness or energy that created it. Now that's true human evolution. So we just don't have a whole lot of evidence right now because everything's spiraling out. But I do believe if we can get enough people in that kind of emergence where there is one mind, one heart, we'll be beyond reproach. Because there's two levels to this. A great point. There is that morphic field that we see that I always say to the student body, hey, every time you go there and every time you overcome yourself, you're leaving a pattern for someone else to latch onto. We're creating momentum, we're creating footsteps, You stop, it's okay, just get back in there and join that field that already exists, right? And so we see that happening in a non-local way. But at the same time, if you're my partner and you come out of the meditation and you say, oh, wow, you got to listen to this, and you tell the person that story and you articulate it in detail, and the person's listening to you and their brain's following you, and there comes a moment where they start putting themselves and imagining the experience, you're setting them up for their own personal experience. It may not happen that way, but they're seeing that you're not a movie star, you're not, buffed and, the young and whatever people relate to, success. We're just common people, right? And so when they start seeing that you're an ordinary person, or anybody's an ordinary person, and they have that experience, they relate with them more. So as the person's explaining and they're exchanging information and we're tracking it, we're actually setting ourselves up for the experience.